Good day, good evening, good morning, whenever you're tuning in. This is Preston Smith with the three things coming to you from The Corners, www.thecorners.pl, as well as CDDI, in case you need an investigator or risk intelligence operative, can I say that, in Central Europe, which would be me, www.cddi.pl. And we are actually located in MRP Studios on the Praga side of Warsaw. It has become fall. We're getting into October. Halloween is around the corner. It's kind of cold and nasty. And yes, I'm under the weather. So if I start coughing or just keel over and die, well, you witnessed it. Otherwise, what are we going to talk about today? A few things, well, three things, but actually a little bit more. But first on the list, we're going to talk about the Balkans and Serbia. Yes, we are. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I'm going to get into that in detail when we finally release the next edition of The Corners, which is coming soon. You can check that out if you go to www.thecorners.pl, but I think I already said that. The second thing we're going to talk about, yes, the Polish elections that took place on October 15th and what is in store. I'm going to give you a bit of a preview, but I will say this right now, that if you are voted for the opposition and you're waiting for the new government to be formed, be patient. And finally, yes, we're going to get back, told you I'm getting sick, back to the Ukrainian war update. A lot is happening right now. It's not all good. It's not all bad. I think we're also in for the long haul. So let's get on to the first thing. Now, the first thing, the Balkans. And yes, I am talking about Serbia again. Some of you may be wondering, why are you not talking about Bulgaria? There's so many crazy things going on down there. A lot of interesting things, actually, there are. But we're not going to talk about Bulgaria today. We're going to talk about Serbia. And this is going to go back, yes, to that raid, that incident back on the 23rd, 24th of September, in which suddenly 30 ethnic Serbs showed up in Banjska or Banjska, however you want to pronounce it. If you're Serbian, I'm sure you pronounce it better than I do, or Kosovo, if you're ethnic Albanian in Kosovo. But that raid took place where these 30 ethnic Serbs showed up very well armed, very well supplied, and they attacked, ambushed a Kosovo police patrol. One ethnic Albanian Kosovo police officer was killed, others were injured. Eventually, we found out that 3 of the Serb assailants were killed. They holed up, had an all-day gunfight on Sunday the 24th. Then they fled. Some of them were arrested, not very many. They managed to get across, I guess, back across the border to Serbia. The alleged leader, we'll just call him Milan B, was arrested. He's being investigated. He was detained. And the reason why I'm bringing this up now, because it's been going on, is that this is absolutely the most bizarre incident. Nobody would have expected this, and I tell you why. Leading up to that raid, President Alexander Vucic in Serbia, and Serbia eventually seemed to be turning the PR tide that it had basically been losing forever and ever since the war in Yugoslavia and the war in Kosovo, and those are pretty big precedents to get over. But as these years went on, from that time, Vucic was making his mantra heard that the Serbians, the ethnic Serbs in North Kosovo, were not being well treated. They were being harassed. They didn't have the rights they should have. They needed to be protected. Yes, he would say from time to time that Kosovo is Serbia, Serbia is Kosovo. We're never going to let it go. But then he would go back to repeating how the Serbs there need to be protected. And as the last year went on, and really actually also in 2022, and we saw this headbutting and this crisis, and then we'd have escalations where you'd have military on the border, we kept seeing the Prime Minister of Kosovo, Albin Kurti, show up during these normalization talks to try to, his goal is to get Kosovo recognized by Serbia as an independent state. Very difficult to do. The EU pushing for this, the US pushing for this, but a lot of frustration with Kurti, to the point that only, in mid-September, there was actually a moment when the High Representative for the EU, Josep Borrell, who's been kind of overseeing these talks, finally he came out and said, we thought we would have a deal, but Kurti wouldn't agree to it. One part of the deal was to give the ethnic Serbs in North Kosovo some more, more say in their existence in the form of a community of Serb municipalities that was basically agreed upon 10 years ago. Okay, Kurti said no. He said, no, you got to recognize Kosovo, and then we'll talk about the rest. That was never going to fly. Okay, that frustrated a number of people in the West to the point that even the Germans and some of the Germans, some of the Dutch that had been hammering on Serbia prior to all this, they weren't saying much. And you kind of saw suddenly Serbia had things going its way. And there were a lot of things going Serbia's way in the sense there was more foreign direct investment. Vucic was actually being seen more as a statesman instead of somebody who kept just shouting Kosovo for Serbs for Kosovo. And then what happens, we have this crazy raid that takes place in Banjka where you had the 30 ethnic Serbs, the people killed, and then the Kosovo police started revealing more and more evidence. And you had 24 SUVs, you had weapons, vanfuls of weapons. This did not look just like some local guys that got mad and pulled off an attack or tried to attack the Kosovo police, which is the kind of thing that does happen still in Kosovo. No, it looked far, far worse. Then Milan B fled to Serbia, and there was promise of an investigation. He was jailed for like a day, and then he's released to kind of house arrest. He can't go back to Kosovo, but okay. This may have turned the tide of once again back against Serbia. And to tell you the truth, nobody can really make sense of this. The U.S. ambassador to Serbia, Christopher Hill, he came out and he said, look, we expect a real investigation. You could see during an interview that he conducted with, that he participated in, that was conducted by N1, one of the Serbia stations there, that he was frustrated, that he expects something to be, that this isn't serious. No one wants this kind of conflict in the Balkans. But then, now if you were looking for evidence to whether or not the tide has kind of turned once again against Serbia when it comes to just kind of the attitude of the West, it's pretty clear because the European Parliament issued a press release. And this is what the press release said, that adopted by a show of hands, they adopted a resolution that condemns in the strongest possible terms, quoting, the hideous and cowardly terrorist attack on Kosovan police officers by well-organized Serbian paramilitaries in Banjka on the 24th of September, 2023. And it urges all sides to de-escalate. But if you go further, the MEPs are following closely the ongoing investigation into the attack, and the MEPs now it's all on Serbia to withdraw all military forward bases located near the Kosovo border, and Serbia and Kosovo must actively work together towards dialogue-led, peaceful dispute resolutions, and they called on both sides to denounce all forms of violence and acts of provocation. That's the typical kind of EU, not jargon, but mantra, whatever you want to call it. But then they even went further. And they said, the MEPs say the Serbian government is pursuing a very dangerous policy with regard to Kosovo and its Western partners, and that the MEPs are closely monitoring the investigations, where he mentioned that. But then if you went further, they talked about targeting restrictive measures, including but not limited to asset freezes, travel bans against destabilizing actors in the north of Kosovo and the leaders of major organized crime networks. Now, what this means, they're upping the ante. They're starting to kind of lay down the law. Now, when it talks about leaders of major organized crime networks, that makes me wonder, because we saw the U.S. hit one of Vucic's key guys, Alexander Vulin, who's kind of the head of the Secret Services, with sanctions stating or alleging that he has been tied to organized crime networks. This is for Serbians, and I have a lot of friends down there. This is not a good thing. Now, Whether or not Vucic was really sincere when basically he had that meeting with Kurti and Borrell and basically accepted the deal that if they if Kosovo allows this community, this municipality, this CSM, this community of Serb municipalities in North Kosovo, if they allow that, then yes, they can go forward on normalization talks. Eventually, that would lead to declaring Kosovo or accepting that Kosovo is an independent country by Serbia. Now, whether or not he was sincere, I don't know. But this is the kind of thing that could have been played out forever and bought time and kept Serbia on the track to join the EU, which means that Serbia keeps getting EU money and EU funds, and the US is happy, the EU is happy, et cetera, et cetera. I have no idea, and I can't find anyone who does, and I've called some different friends of mine down in Serbia that are kind of connected, say, what was the deal? Who planned this? Why did this happen? Was this just a cowboy thing? How did they get the SUVs? I think a lot of people are flummoxed by this, but the EU, or at least the European Parliament, came out and they kind of laid down the law and said where they stand, why the US kind of said, you kind of get the feeling they're like, what are you guys doing? I don't think anybody really knows right now, but it's something to consider because you can love or hate Vucic. You can say what you want about Vucic. You can criticize Serbian press law. You can criticize just the judicial law in general there. The fact that for years we've had organized crime issues in Serbia, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look around, you're wondering, well, who would replace Vucic when it comes to someone, whether you like him or not, whether you agree with him or not, that is kind of sort of keeping it going, keeping it from just turning into I don't even know what. The opposition in Serbia, for years they put on marches, but you don't see them coming together. At least I haven't yet. I may be wrong in this. You can write me and tell me. We're wondering what happens if one day Vucic decides to go. And he's kind of talked about this once in a while. Another thing he's done, he's relinquished control of his party. He was the head of his party. He now has said that, yes, we will hold elections in December. I believe it's December 17th, if I remember. And the opposition will get what they want. And he's not stepping away from Russia or Hungary, kind of the bad boy that there's a lot at stake here, a lot at play that people are ignoring. In part, you've got the war in Ukraine. You've also got this horrible situation in Israel, in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. But it's something to keep an eye on, and we will do that. But now let's get on to the second thing, which also gets into elections, the Polish elections. So here we go. So the second thing, the Polish elections. Yes, on October 15th, we Poles all came out and voted. And when I say that we all came out and voted, that includes me, I voted. But also a whole lot of other Poles, 74.4%. 74.4%. That is some participation. The Poles have to be proud about that. And what happened? Well, what happened, as you probably know by now, if you followed this at all, is the opposition won. Well, yes and no, not quite. It's not quite that simple in the sense that when it came down to it, the Law and Justice Party, which has kind of reigned supreme forever, it seems, and I'm not going to take a side on the parties. I'm going to hold back and I'm going to criticize everybody. But they did get the most votes. They got 35.4% of the votes. I believe these were the final tallies. If I'm slightly off, forgive me, but I think these are the final tallies. Civic Coalition, which is, I always think of that as Civic Platform. Donald Tusk, who's still around, he's going to be the candidate for prime minister. Civic Coalition got the next largest percentage, 30.7%. The left, or Levica, 8.6%. The third way, Trzecia Droga, this is really interesting. There was a time going into the election when people were worried they weren't going to get enough to make it into parliament. And since they had to get 8%, because that's really a coalition, they definitely made it in. They have 14.4%, but again, it may be a little bit tricky. And then finally, you had Confederacja, very libertarian. Sometimes they said some things that I didn't like. I will say that. 7.2%. Now, When it comes down to who will control parliament, well, if this coalition holds, if they form a government, they have got control, which would give them in parliament, that would be a total of 248 seats. They would also have significant control in the Senate with 66 seats, and peace would only have 34. However, a couple of things here. Well, first of all, let's talk about why did peace do so badly? And did they do so badly? Well, yes and no. They did do badly in the sense that they didn't retain control of parliament, and they didn't do so badly in the sense that they kind of got what they always get with their core, and when it comes to their core support, that's going to be always around 34 to 36%. Well, that's where they came in. And you say, well, you know, why did people think they were going to win? Well, there were a few reasons. I mentioned that a couple weeks back when I said that, you know, you never know when it comes to the polls. Well, I'm talking about the surveys. The surveys in Poland, when it comes to voters' surveys, a lot of times were not always maybe the most reliable. Sometimes you would find out that they were only calling, like, checking out what people thought in the big cities, which seemed to be more aligned with KO or PO in the past. And so there was the kind of the thought that they might get a jump in support. But there were a couple of things that they didn't do that they could have done. And people are even wondering why they didn't do. Now, of course, things did hurt them. There were scandals or controversies. The way they approached the judicial system here and the way they were talking about how they're going to take further control over it and how they, you know, this might lead, you know, the people were pondering, is this going to mean like a poll exit? That kind of thing was, yeah, I don't think Poles want a poll exit. They want to stay in the EU. That's pretty clear. When you look at the overall vote and when you've looked at other surveys that have just asked polls across the board, yeah, most of them want to stay in the EU. I think that they kind of misunderstood just the general sentiment. That's one thing. But a couple of things they didn't do that have people wondering. One, they didn't seem to, like, you know, approach some of the potential coalition partners previously. They didn't seem to create much of a dialogue with Confederation. Maybe they thought they differ too much when it comes to social handouts. They didn't seem to approach a party that seems to be still maybe a key player when it comes to forming a government. That's the PSL. There were some strategic moves that we kind of thought they would have done going into the election. They didn't do. But they did one thing that nobody's really talking about that I think that really hurt them. And it also kind of sort of gave a flavor of where they were coming from, which was not really, I don't think, up with the times. And that was this referendum. Now, some of you go, what do you mean if you're not following that closely? You mean they had the elections, they had a referendum? I thought a referendum is it? No, well, yes. But you had the elections to pick the party that you wanted to get into parliament. But the referendum was basically getting Poles to vote on 4 questions that I understood that peace believed would kind of crystallize the sentiment of Poles, and if you ask me, sway their vote in the voting booth. Because I tell you how it looked, which I don't think should happen, to be honest, is that you went into the voting booth and you had your big sheet of paper with all the parties and all the candidates, and you had to go and try to find the guy you liked and the party you liked and check it. Okay, that's normal. But then you had a second sheet of paper. On the second sheet of paper, there were 4 questions. And these 4 questions, you read them at the same time that you were voting. And in a way, I didn't like this at all. I don't think this should be allowed. I'm not the one who makes the laws here. I just think that's kind of akin to sort of like throwing out your commercial during the actual voting process, because you're putting forward, obviously, Peace was putting forward, obviously, what they thought and how they thought things should go as an opinion at the same time that the votes were taking place. That's what I think. Doesn't mean it's true, but let's talk about the questions and how I think this backfired. Well, the questions were, and these are the official translations. 1, are you in favor of selling off state assets to foreign entities, leading to the loss of control by Polish women and men over strategic sectors of the economy? I mean, come on, that's kind of loaded, but okay. Didn't have to be worded that way. 2nd, are you in favor of raising the retirement age, including restoring the increased retirement age of 67 for women and men? Well, if you're looking at the retirement age here, and you're getting older, and you're talking about, do I work, do I not work, when do I get, that's also loaded too, but okay. Number 3, are you in favor of removing the barrier on the border between the Republic of Poland and the Republic of Belarus? Now, this is where things got really loaded, because that's kind of not how it read in Polish, but I'll get to that in a minute. And finally, are you in favor of admitting the thousands of illegal immigrants from the Middle East and Africa in line with the forced relocation mechanism imposed by the European bureaucracy? Again, okay, now, when I say kind of not how it says, don't jump on me. If this was the official translation. If you put this into, I don't know, Google Translate, you'd get that translation. I'm not saying the translation is wrong. I'm just saying that when you read it in Polish, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Just talk about this last one especially. Well, actually, I don't know if we should. It really, when it came to questions 3 and 4. Are you in favor, 3, are you in favor of removing the barrier on the border between the Republic of Poland and the Republic of Belarus? Actually, what they said when it came to removing was they used the word liquidation, right? So it's like, are you in favor of liquidating the barrier on the border between Poland and Belarus? You know, that, and you know, I'm not saying that technically you can't write that. I'm saying that, but when I imagine, okay, we have the war in Ukraine, we have Belarus, we have Poland. There are a lot of issues. There have been tons of issues with Lukashenko fooling immigrants from the Middle East and different regions, Africa, and getting them to flying them even to Belarus, and then trying to shove them across the border. Huge problems. This is absolutely insane. Poland was put in a bad position, a horrible position by this. I'm not saying that everything on the border has been, that everyone's guilt-free, but I am blaming this on Lukashenko. However, when you use the word liquidating and you walk in there and you're voting, you're liquidating? Like, there's not going to be any border? It's going to be like Poland and Belarus are going to be the same country? I mean, this was, you know, and then the next one, it was, are you in favor of admitting thousands of illegal immigrants from the Middle East and Africa in line with the forced relocation mechanism? The way that actually read in Polish, and yes, I do, all these years, I still have an accent, but zgodnie z przymusowym mechanizmem relokacji narzucanym przez biurokrację europejską, whatever. But that word, when I said narzucanym, which is horrible for me to pronounce actually, you know, that's not really what I would have expected, how I would have expected it to be written, because it's kind of the way that when you hear that, like if your wife yells at you or whatever, it's like, that's like that this was thrown upon the Poles. That's really the way that reads. That's how that sounds. Now, can you write it like that? Yeah. Would it normally be written like that? Well, I have received plenty of pieces of paper from courts, from lawyers. That's just the nature of my job. Also, if you set up a business here and you file for licenses, you do anything, you deal with tons of bureaucratic paperwork. With tax issues, if they question you, hey, did you do that right or whatever, not saying I'm doing them wrong, you deal with this all the time. We know, Poles know, because all Poles deal with this stuff all the time. We know how things are usually written when it comes to administrative Polish, and when it comes to kind of, you know, and it kind of goes back to sort of communist era. That's just the way things are written, and they're not written like that. I would not expect to see that word. I would expect to have seen something like, that would have been translated in English more like, in accordance, and okay, if you want to say forced, okay, because it reads the forced mechanism, but in accordance with the forced relocation mechanism, that is, I would expect it to be more translated, required by the current regulations of the European Union. Instead of thrown upon us, which is really how it reads, they translate it as imposed by the European bureaucracy. Okay, again, these are loaded questions. Now, to make a long explanation, to cut it short, I think this really backfired on peace, and I'll tell you why. When I went in there and I saw this, I started to read this, I actually burst out laughing because for me it was over the top. And you say, okay, well, you weren't born in Poland, okay, fair enough. But I heard other people burst out laughing. Other people kind of said, come on. I mean, it was like, this is, you know, over the top. I don't think this worked. It certainly, well, clearly it didn't work. It didn't gain them any support. It didn't, it wasn't something that was going to be convincing to, say, fence sitters, and there weren't a lot of fence sitters or persons in Poland that hadn't decided going into the election, because it was pretty polarized when we went in there. But I don't think this worked to PiS's advantage at all. But this gets us to our next point, which is after the election, I did see a lot of people celebrating, and the opposition has been very vocal in this sense. They also like to come out and march. We had the March of a Million Hearts that looked like a million people anyway in Warsaw. And so I saw a lot of celebration, a lot of people saying, that's it, peace is done, blah, 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 blah. Okay, hold on. I think a lot of people don't understand the way things work. The way it works, if you are the party that gets the most votes, you have the right to try to form a government first. This means that PiS does have the right to try to form a government first. And since the president, Andrzej Duda, is basically a PiS guy, he's going to give them that right. Wouldn't have expected him not to. But I think this is going to take a while. And what does this usually mean? Well, this usually means that a party that doesn't have enough votes is still going to try to form a government, is going to try to pick off potential parliamentary members from other parties or groups, whatever. Now, there's been a lot of talk that are already targeting the PSL, and you say, oh, well, they won't do that. That'd be crazy because they do that. If you look at 74.4% of Poles voted, we can see what Poles wanted. The majority wants this. Why would they do that? Well, I don't know. The other thing is they have a lot of time. I wouldn't expect the earliest I think that you could see a government formed in Poland, that's going to be like December, right? That's a long time from now. And then once the opposition comes in, you've got a president that can veto whatever the opposition wants to put forward. So I don't think we're going to see any day-to-day changes. And some of the promises from the opposition were basically, Donald Tusk, he did say he's going to change a few things just like overnight as soon as they win. I don't see how that's going to happen. There may be quite a bit of frustration built up. There may be, we may see people defect from this coalition, and these coalition partners, I'm not sure how much they have in common with each other, except that they don't like peace. So the challenges moving ahead are going to be, I'm not saying insurmountable, but they are going to be challenging. So basically the ride starts now. But let's get on to the third thing. Now the third thing, the Ukrainian war update. Okay, last week we didn't do this. We had a very special guest in the sense that we had an official from the Belarusian government in exile, Vice Speaker Elena Zhivoglod, which was a great interview. You should go and watch that. And thanks for all the people that watch. It's like 6,000 views so far. And also like and subscribe. I should say that at the beginning of these shows. But like and subscribe. But since that time, and I mentioned it last week, a lot has been happening, not only in world events, but also in Ukraine, which may be indicative of what we're looking at as the winter begins and the weather goes sour. And, I don't know. I don't want to be too pessimistic. There are some good things happening, but I don't want to be too pessimistic. First, though, we have to note that we're already seeing signs of the U.S. turning its focus, its military focus, and that includes supplies of shells, weapons, to the situation in Israel and not to Ukraine. If we go back to the subject of Ukraine, we have seen some very interesting developments where the U.S. has supplied some very effective weapons. Of course, we're talking about the ATACM missiles that had a much longer range than, say, HIMARS and caught the Russians off guard. The Ukrainian strikes on the Russian airfields, specifically in Berdyansk and Luhansk, they may have eliminated up to 14 helicopters. And the helicopters, these Ka Alligator helicopters that the Russians were using, definitely were holding Ukrainians back when it came to trying to put to use any of that mechanized armor that has been supplied by, say, the UK, the Challengers. Now the US with the Abrams tanks, we're seeing them show up. We've got Leopards on the ground. We're going to talk about those in a minute. But what happened when this really seems to have caught the Russians off guard? Just like the drone strikes, the missile strikes, forced the Russians to pull back their navy after they took some, pretty serious losses. These strikes have had some opining that now is the perfect time, the best time for the Ukrainians to make a hard push, for example, in Zaporizhzhia, with armor, with tanks, and try to drive down and maybe hit Tokmak, whatever. We're going to talk about that in a minute. What definitely did happen, or what seems to have happened, it sent some shockwaves through Russia. Now, Putin and the Russian government, they basically mentioned they were very unhappy with the supply, the fact that the U.S. supplied these ATACMs. I've heard others, if you look at Russian bloggers, that say, hey, this has put us literally on the edge of the real Third World War. There's some more of the Russian brandishing, hey, we've got nukes. They've been saying that forever. Although there were some tests a few weeks back, which kind of made us worry and wonder a bit. But then you have the Ukrainian side and the Russian side talking about the Russians don't know what yet to do with these ATACMs, with this advanced range, and the fact that they can't shoot them down yet. So it gives the Ukrainians a window for an all-out offensive, counteroffensive that could maybe change the course of the war. This could happen shortly. This could happen over the next couple of weeks. We don't know how long this window will last. I've seen a lot of talk like that. Perhaps it is true. On the back of that, we are seeing some activity by the Ukrainians in Kherson. We are seeing some activity that's very interesting in Robotnia, in Zaporizhzhia. But one of the things we are also seeing, and I'm going to go through this on the maps, is that the Russians have been extremely aggressive with their own offensive or counteroffensive to the Ukrainian counteroffensive to the Russian offensive, which is what we're going to talk about. So let's go to the maps. Okay, now first of all, just a quick look. You'll take a look and you'll see this big map. I just want to put that up first just to give you guys an idea of where everything is. You see Kherson. If you haven't been following us, you see Kherson down at the bottom left. You go up Zaporizhzhia. That front is very important. That's where Robotnia is. That's also where, if you go a little bit further to the east, northeast, you hit Staromaerska, then you got Donetsk, you got Luhansk, and you go all the way up to where the Kupiansk front is. And although it doesn't say Kupiansk there, you can see where I went and hit the button that showed the 25th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, a Russian unit brigade that's up there, and that's about where Kupiansk is, just so you guys can orient yourself on the map. Now, I will say these are Deepstate UA maps, incredibly useful resource. Got to give them credit there. But now let's go and start from the south, because that's how I introduce this. Down in Kherson. Now, in Kherson, we are seeing some very interesting things happening. There have been, over the last month or 6 weeks, various raids and sometimes teasers that the Ukrainians are going to try to cross the river, create a bridgehead, and then maybe do something substantial there, which would actually cause the Russians a lot of problems. This seems to be something that is ongoing now. Now, the first time we saw this happen. You can see this map. You see where Kosovo Laheri is. That didn't work out. The Russians managed to drive the Ukrainians out, maybe kill all the Ukrainians that made it across the river there and had a little beachhead. But we're seeing a couple things happen. One, and if you'll see this Avdiivka, and if you go up past to the northeast, past Kosovo Laheri, I think you can see it on the map, Krinky. The Ukrainians have actually been very active, and they've crossed the river and have beachheads to various extents in both places. In Krinky, a little less. In Avdiivka, a little more. In fact, it may be even more than we think. And if you take a look at the various bits of news that are coming out there, you're hearing completely different things. One is that the Ukrainians are actually getting substantial reserves across the river, across those islands, into this beachhead where you've got Avdiivka. Now you see this you've got a gray area on the other side of the river, south of basically Kherson, or what you're seeing on this map is Sadova, and then in that. Krinky, a little bit less so. Now, what we do know is the Russians are shelling and trying to do everything they can to stop anything from happening in both locations, which including targeting the boats, trying to make sure nobody can get back and forth across the river. The Ukrainians are probably under an incredible amount of pressure, but more and more we're seeing that it looks as if they're actually getting somewhere in Pishchanivka. You can take a look at that map on Pishchanivka. It doesn't really show you much. There's not a lot I can show you there, except that this does not look like sort of the Kozachi Laheri raid, which was there a few days and then just did not work and the Ukrainians were driven out. This looks to be more substantial, and eventually it could turn into something that is going to divert the Russians' attention from Robotnia, which is where we are going next. Now, you'll see this this first picture, actually that salient, I call it a salient, but that kind of dip down from just below Orkiv, that is where Robotnia is. And we're getting quite a few reports of both the Russians and the Ukrainians basically stating that they are on the offensive. Now, we know the Ukrainians have pushed towards Kopani, which I'm going to show you that in a second. And we know the Ukrainians have pushed further south, but we also know the Russians have really thrown in everything they can to stop any type of progress. Now, if you take a look at that map before I go to the next map, you will see Tokmak way down there. That has been ostensibly the goal, and you can still see it's not labeled here on this map, but to the right of that salient, of that kind of, if you want to call it like a big beachhead, which is Robotnia, to the right of that you have the Verbove city. And then you can see those trench lines kind of angling down, those Russian trench lines, sort of in the direction of Tokmak. That's what we talk about every month, where, you know, maybe there could be a breakthrough with mechanized armor and make a run kind of between in that avenue and get in or cross those and head toward Tokmak. I remain fairly skeptical. But if we go to the next map, there are some interesting reports. First of all, if you take a look just south of Robotnia and you see Prokopivka. We've heard now for weeks that the Ukrainians are on the verge of taking that, and then they're not taking, then they are taking, they're getting somewhere. What's interesting now are reports, and these aren't just from one blogger or two bloggers, but some leopards have shown up in that fight, actually at Prokopivka, which is interesting, which means maybe the Ukrainians are buying into this, that thanks to the ATACMs, the attack that push those helicopters maybe back out of effective range, those Russian K alligators, that maybe they have a chance to use these tanks and actually get somewhere. We know they're putting pressure on Prokopivka, but again, we don't know. It doesn't seem like that they're able to take it. Now, if you take a look at this next map, which shows, again, the trench lines, and it shows Robotnia, you'll see Kopani. We've mentioned before that the Ukrainians are going to push hard there. They are pushing hard there, but we've also heard there are Russian counterattacks there, just as there have been Russian counterattacks all along the western flanks of Robotnia, and we're not hearing that there is a lot of progress being made at that time. If we take a look at the next map, which is a satellite map that also shows Verbove, and Robotnia, we know that the Ukrainians have actually attacked north of those lines of Verbove, and they've attacked more than once just straight down the pipe into Verbove. So this is where we're seeing a lot of activity. So on the Zaporizhzhia front, actually down in Kherson, that is where the Ukrainians seem to be the most active, and they may be considering to finally throw it all in there and to make a final push before the weather really does go sour. Now, if we go a little bit further east, slightly to the north, we hit Staromayorsky. I'm not seeing a lot of progress there. The Russians apparently, though, if you take a look at this map, you see Pryutnya, and I mentioned several times that the Ukrainians would love to move forward there and also maybe eliminate this kind of this Russian-held territory that goes further north to the west of Staromayorsky. Instead, we're seeing the Russians basically attack there, and we're not seeing any progress. I think that front, maybe we may see a case of the Ukrainians kind of holding the line, because there does seem to be a very hard push by Putin. In fact, he summoned his generals again. Gerasimov got called on the carpet again to get something done. stop the, they want to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensive, but it's clear that they want to see progress. And actually, what's interesting, when you see those videos and you see Putin meet with Gerasimov, man, Gerasimov looks so old now, so just doddering. And not that Putin looks great, but you kind of, you start to see on that side of it, the kind of just the image side, they when they show these short film clips, these are the Russians putting these out, kind of indicative. Doesn't look like they're doing well just themselves, physically, psychologically, whatever. But let's go north to what has become the big news over the course of the last 2 weeks, really, which is the Russian offensive on the Avdiivka front. Now, if you take a look at this map, you will see you've got Marinka, Staromykhailovka. It's not just Avdiivka, but that is where we just keep hearing again and again that the Russians are throwing in endless numbers of troops and armor, tanks, everything. This is where Gerasimov was called maybe he was called on the carpet and said, you better take something. We need an answer to Robotnia. We need to show that we're getting something done, because this does not look like one of those typical Russian offensives where they attack for a few days and then it sort of peters out and like maybe everybody sits back in the trenches and says, man, that was a drag. We don't need to do that anymore. No. This is far, far different. If you take a look at a closer map of Avdiivka, you're going to understand this a little bit better. You see Avdiivka, which is in the middle. That's the town. That's the city. But you've got Russian, and those arrows are from Deepstate UA. I didn't put those in. But the Russians are conducting serious attacks south of Avdiivka, so around Prvomaisk, actually, Nevelsky, Prvomaisk, Severne, Vodnyane, down there. And these are serious attacks, but where we're seeing what sounds like just absolute butchery is in the north, where you got Krasnohorivka and Vesela, and the goal is they're driving towards, eventually, we understand, towards Berdichi. Now, if we go, let's talk about the south first. We heard at first that the Russians, this was very scary, because they could this pincer attack could cause the Ukrainians to need to pull out of Avdiivka and maybe cause them very serious losses. This would be a huge blow to the entire, the whole story of the Ukrainian counteroffensive since the spring of this year. Now, we understand that there's various reports. One, the Russians are making some progress, but limited progress down around the Vodnyane sector of this battle. The Ukrainians apparently have launched counterattacks south of Prvomaiski. However, you've got two different opinions on this. One, that Ukrainians built up and they launched this attack, which is going to take the air out of the Russian pincer movement and cause them to be unable to complete this. The other is that you got Russian bloggers basically saying this is all complete garbage. The Ukrainians aren't getting anything there. It's more of a PR type of move. Not sure. What is fairly clear is that, like I said, in the north, it is much, much uglier. And this is this Krasnohorivka. You see Stepovi there. Actually, a little bit further to the east, not on this map, which is a satellite map, is Berdichi. But let's talk about this Krasnohorivka battle. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but you may be able to see on this map. I tried, that's why I did it this way. You may be able to see there's kind of below Krasnohorivka, there's sort of a circle which looks like kind of on this map like a dark spot, like a crater. That is Terikon. Okay, Terikon is like a kind of a mountain hill, trash slag heap of mine tailings. It also provides fire control, because if you hold those heights, then you have the advantage in the north. Now, there have just been day after day crazy assaults by the Russians on this, and you get one day you hear that they've taken Terikon, then you hear no they didn't, then you hear they took it today, no they didn't, then you hear yes they took it today, no they didn't. From the very get-go, there were stories of the Russians losing hundreds of tanks, hundreds of vehicles. It's hard to know last I saw was that seemed to be somewhat believable was 175 vehicles and tanks combined over the course of a couple of days. That might or might not be true. It's very hard to get any kind of confirmation on this kind of thing. But what is understood is that they are just throwing waves of attackers into this fight, and trying to take Tarkhan has been a nightmare. Now, the pessimists, if you are for the Ukrainians, are going to say, hey, we understand that Tarkhan now is lost or no one has control over it, which means the Russians will probably eventually take control. The pessimists are also saying that the Russians basically have complete air superiority there in terms of drones, that the Ukrainians are just getting droned to death again, and that they're unable to do any kind of jamming or to limit the Russian drone coverage there, which that may be true. The optimists are saying, no, the Ukrainians have basically caused such high losses among the Russians that they're not going to be able to actually accomplish their goal of moving forward to Stepovo and then Berdichi and then basically closing the pincer. There are also optimists that are saying that Ukrainians have launched a counteroffensive more from the north beyond that pincer, which is going to cause a lot of problems for the Russians. Believe what you want to believe. What I do believe, if I'm going to be a pessimist, is that the Ukrainians are having a difficult time when it comes to ammunition. When I'm going to be an optimist, I do think they have launched. I more tend to believe that they've launched a counteroffensive in the north to stop this pincer than to attack the pincer from the south. I will say that we have to keep an eye on this. If we take a look, we go further north to Bakhmut. There is talk that the Russians are going to mount a sustained push and try to take back Klishevka and Avdiivka. There's been talk ever since the Russians actually basically took Klishevka and Avdiivka. However, there does seem to be a sustained assault at Ivanivsky and at Yehidny, as you can see on the map. That's all I'm going to say about that, because I don't have anything really more that I can tell you. Now, Bilohorivka, we've talked about this, that further north, the Russians have been conducting operations there forever, and they haven't been making much progress. So we're going to skip that. We're also going to skip Svatovo, because even though I was worried about the Svatovo front early on, and this combined 200,000, which was Svatovo and the Kupiansk front, I'm not seeing that the Russians are getting much done there. I am a little bit more worried once again about Kupiansk, because you've got the Russians really pushing down at Orlyanka, and also out of the north, out of Liman Pershib. Now you're going to say, Preston, you've been saying this forever. You've been saying that the Russians have 100,000 there, that Sinkivka is in danger forever. Is it really? Are you kind of exaggerating this? No, I'm not. I still believe that this is a dangerous area of the front for the Ukrainians, but I do think that what has held the Russians back from the start has been the fact that they hate that out of this 100,000 supposed troops that are up there, a big chunk of that comes out of this is the 25th separate guards, which you can see on the map, and these were hastily thrown together, possibly not really hardcore enough with enough training to actually get much done. And I think this is still kind of the status quo and which will remain for the time being. That said, I'm not going to be overly optimistic. I think that what we're really seeing when we put all this together is that the lines have somewhat solidified for the winter. And although I think the Russians are going to keep throwing in basically their troops into the various meat grinders, I don't think that either side is going to make serious gains. That's my prediction. And we'll probably be waiting to see what happens even after Christmas before we can see some kind of real movement from either side. Hopefully, I'm wrong when it comes to the Ukrainians, and hopefully, I'm not wrong when it comes to the Russians. Otherwise, here's me face, over and out. Come back next week. Looks like we've got some other visitors, interviews coming up, which are going to be very interesting. Otherwise, you guys hold tight, be optimists, don't be like Preston, and come back and check out the 3 things, and check out thecorners.pl. New magazine's going to show up soon, I promise. It's only about 3 weeks late, but there you go. But anyway, God be with you and take care.